Hello, and welcome to the Jewish Heretics podcast. This is the official podcast of the United Jewish People's Order and the Morris Winchevsky Center. We are a secular, progressive Canadian Jewish organization that's been around since the 1920s. We're a multifaceted cultural and activist community with a summer camp called Camp Nijvelt, a school, a shula for children and adults, an extensive Yiddish archive, and branches in different Canadian cities. My name is David Wall, and I am the United Jewish People's Order cultural programmer, and I'll be your host today. For this, the second ever episode of our podcast, I had the honor of interviewing the great Yael. Here's a brief overview of her incredibly varied career. Yael is a Toronto-based filmmaker, video and installation artist, and activist. She is professor of integrated media at OCAD University, or Ontario College of Art and Design. Her work is exhibited nationally in Canada and internationally and has been shown in various settings, from festivals to galleries to community and activist groups, as well as various educational venues. Her essay film, Trading the Future, won the Audience Award at the Ecofilms Festival in Rhodes, Greece. Yael's films and installations have dealt with the many intersections of identity and family. They have focused on activist initiatives in Israel-Palestine, as well as notions of apocalypse and geopolitical environmental urgencies. Select film titles include Fresh Blood, A Consideration of Belonging, In the Middle of the Street, and Palestine Trilogy. Her long list of collaborative and collective projects include Spontaneous Combustion, The Olive Project by the Hard Press Collective, and the Approximations series created with Johanna Householder. Yael premiered the animated film Lessons for Polygamists at the Images Festival in April 2017. No Lies, a 1-minute short and silent version of this, won the Most Original Film by a Local Female Director award at the 2016 Toronto Urban Film Festival, and first prize at the 2018 Got a Minute Film Festival in Edmonton, Alberta. She's currently working on a memoir on her family story at the center of this film. In 2021, a celebration of her work entitled Family States was published, featuring essays by art and academic luminaries and edited by fellow filmmaker Mike Holbloom. And we've really just scratched the surface here. So before we listen to my discussion with Yael, I just wanted to reflect a bit on it and give a bit of context. I've known her for a good 20 years, and I've always found her passion for art making, which is linked with frontline activism, to be incredibly inspiring. Like many accomplished artists, she tends to downplay her achievements, and you're going to hear at one point in our interview, she maintains that she doesn't consider herself to be prolific, which I took with a massive grain of salt, because, of course, all you have to do is go online and you'll see this seemingly sort of endless list of projects she's been involved with, collaborations and videos, et cetera, installations. Anyway, Yael's career seems to me to be often concerned with intersections, hybrids of identity and ideology. For example, we sort of organically ended up talking about two of her many films, the most. Fresh Blood, which she made in 1996, and Trading the Future from 2008. In Fresh Blood, she explores, among other things, her own complex identities as a Jew of Arab descent, as well as an Ashkenazi Jew, and also as a person raised from the age of 7 in an evangelical Christian home, all in the context of intertwining and conflicting racial hierarchies in Israel-Palestine. One interesting conclusion made in the film is that Arab Jews in Israel are kind of implicitly trained to consider themselves to be their own enemy. In Trading the Future from 2008, she starts from her own childhood, her own experiences of fearing the end of the world when Jesus will return to judge everyone, and she ends up describing how capitalism and the market economy has co-opted this idea of apocalypse, and that in the end, resisting this end of days idea means resisting capitalism. So what I'm saying is she seems to constantly inject her own personal complicated identities into her political analysis. And in the end, we're going to hear that maybe this intertwining of the personal and the political is kind of her main project. Sorry to blabber on so much. I really was inspired by our conversation, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Here is our interview with filmmaker Yael. Hello, how are you?
Good, David. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks so much for taking time out to be on the Jewish Heretics podcast.
It's a privilege
Well, that's
to be
nice to hear. That's
identified
nice
as
to hear.
such.
Let's hear how you feel when it's over, whether it's still a privilege. You have such an incredible, varied career with so much incredible work and activism and academic work and curating, festivals and political events and all of the film work. And so, just to kind of, in a sense, get out of the way, I am going to be asking you a series of pretty typical questions, even on the trite side, but hopefully it'll kind of lubricate our conversation, and then we'll get into more maybe juicy topics.
Okay.
Is that all right?
Absolutely.
So the first whopper is, tell me about your beginnings as an artist. When did you know you wanted to follow that path to be an artist, and how did you start your practice?
I think my first exposures were when I was a student at York. I was an English student, and my roommates were a dancer, a musician, and a visual artist. And so I think that was my first intro, and I realized that there was something there that was yearning to have expression. And but I continued on to teachers college instead, and then only after I had Misha, I had already started taking some courses, like at ArtSec, which was this alternative art school in Toronto, with people like Joyce Wieland, and that really sparked things, much more so. So I decided to go to OCA at the time, and I was also seeing a lot of feminist work and also a lot of video art that was being done, and it was really new. This was like beginning of the 80s, and I knew that I wanted to learn some of the newer technologies and to work with video. So I had been painting up until then, and video was the new frontier.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Can you tell me? I'm ignorant.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell me? I hear the words bandied about a lot. So, what's the difference between film and video? And I don't just mean in terms of the technology. Oh, film is on a reel and video is magnetic tape. When you talk about a video artist, what's the connotation? Because it strikes me as a special thing.
I think there's a number of things, but certainly the material qualities are significant here as well. The fact that video is electronically based and it started on tape and following on audio tape, and then being able to be imaged, but and film requires way more resources, way more light, way more just I guess if you're shooting in Super 8 or something, you can still get away with a lot of experimentation and not having too much crew, but the resources are much more. So, certainly in terms of funds that you need to do it. So video had a very a beginning with the Porter Pack, and that aspect allowed early video artists to take this equipment out in the field to experiment with it. And so I think partly the initial mobility of it, but an accessibility and the way it could be used both in terms of experimentation and for activist purposes made it much more accessible in artists' hands, as it were, in terms of the 70s and 80s, which is when it was really kind of burgeoning. And but I think also what developed was a different kind of language in a certain way with video and the cinematic form. Now they've both merged, and now people are using film when it's video, and the terms don't mean as much anymore. But initially, it was very much about taking the image making and the moving image into one's own hand, bringing them into one's personal sphere, allowing for ways in which to play with narrative and with and that certainly was being done in film, but I think it was much more about accessibility and playing, and also commenting on television, because video was much more akin to television in terms of the material quality. And so initially there was a way in which it was a kind of alternative media to what was out in the mainstream as well.
So interesting. Can you tell
Mhm.
me about your early experiences at Ontario College of Art, OCA, and how formative that was, and the sort of teachers you had, and your experiences there?
Yeah, I mean, certainly OCA was really the place where I took off with video, and I had people in my who are still people that I love and respect, and who are part of the local community. People like Lisa Steele, who was very involved, who did a lot of performance work in her video and put herself into her videos, and so that gave me an example of both making work that was politically motivated, personally motivated, and also that you could play with narrative and be political in the work that you're making all those connections. So certainly Lisa was very influential. People like Nora Hutchinson, and then even out in the community, Vera Frankel. I interviewed her when I was in my fourth year, I remember, and she was very significant in terms of the kind of ways that she was working with video. And so yeah, and also other people around in the community. I mean, certainly people who like Richard Fung and John Grayson, who very well, were just coming up. Like I remember meeting John for the first time in Lisa's class, and he had just come back from Nicaragua and had done an activist film on farmers there. So there was all of that kind of influence at OCA, but also in the community at large. And and there wasn't as much of you're a student. I was also a bit of an older student. I already had done some studies. I had a kid, so I wasn't functioning in the same way. Certainly not socially always. I couldn't go out to party, for example. But what it meant was that I didn't feel as like the division between being a student and being a novice artist and being out in the community were that divided.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I'd like to circle back. You talk about the politics involved in the art, and all of these people you mentioned: Richard Fung, John Grayson, obviously, Vera Frankel.
Mm.
Um, was the idea that you were always a political artist? And is it even possible to not be a political artist? Do you know what I mean? And
Yeah,
how important was that? Always important to you from the very beginning?
I think at the beginning I was wanting to kind of like explore some of my own narrative and family story. And what was really great was that there was some really good input in terms of feminist critique at the time, and feminist artists that were around. And so right away, I think it just came along with the territory in terms of looking at images of women, the whole critique around how women are viewed, how women are in the workplace, in the home, in the domestic sphere, etc. That was already very much part of my formation and education. And so, and that adage, which I always say, the feminist adage, the personal is political, and for the political is personal, is really at base for me from the beginning. But I would also say that, there's lots of artists who say, oh, I'm not political, but even in that choice, they're being political. Like they're choosing a specific kind of way to approach. And I certainly love work that is still formal, and that takes in all of that's really concerned with the language of the visual medium as well. But all of that is still political.
Absolutely. I'm reminded when you're talking about the way that you explored the ideas of the domesticity of women and the feminist
Mhm.
issues. I really love the work you did with Johanna Hausholder, where you're reimagining, for example, 2001, but you're like an astronaut, but you're in a kitchen with a refrigerator and stuff, sort of what was supposed to be a woman's scope. Can you talk about that collaboration with Johanna Hausholder, and also just talk a bit about who she is?
Yes, I love Johanna. She's one of the Clichettes, performance art group that worked with what's lip syncing as part of their form, and she's got a wicked sense of humor. And somehow, and Johanna and I had been teaching together, and Johanna taught in the same area as I do at OCAD. I was thinking about apocalypse at the time, and she was thinking about apocalypse now, and just the kind of ways in which there were resonances. But somehow, between in our conversations, we ended up in my bedroom, and she was the Martin Sheen character, and we decided to do shot for shot recreations of the hotel scene in Apocalypse Now. Yes, and so and we really appreciated that the way in which the domestic was being mapped into those kind of narratives, and putting female body in the place of this male body, and how that changed the narrative, or just the implication, or just brought out some of those significations that are in that film. And for me, I think it was also this idea of apocalypse had really been taking me over, because it was just around the time of the millennial turn, and so yeah, I think it was just something that, and so then we went on to a few other films, like 2001 Space Odyssey, which is the one you mentioned, and again, putting the female body in the place of the male astronaut, and then mapping the spaceship onto the domestic scene, and thinking through, and also we just had so much fun. It was really DIY in terms of our approach, like very, very do it yourself, very low tech, and a lot of fun.
And of course, you entered the pantheon of actors, including Willem Dafoe and Max von Sydow, when you played Jesus Christ, right?
Yes, that was fun. Yeah, that was back into Johanna's backyard, and the Passion of the Christ, and I was Jesus, which is a great honor, and
And has an interesting, as we'll see, an interesting sort of resonance with your own upbringing. Um,
absolutely,
so
yes.
I wanted to sort of get into that now, because with you, it's a whole kettle of fish. Like, the idea of this podcast is supposed to be that we're looking at alternative or radical or secularist ways of expressing Jewishness. And so one of the first questions I asked Max, and this is only the second episode, but the idea is, did you have an aha moment when you changed your own sense of Jewishness? But with you, you've had a really interesting and complex, I'll call it, religious trajectory, because you were brought up from a young age in an evangelist, I assume, Christian household, kind of raised under an ever-present fear of the rapture, that Jesus was going to come back and it would be the end of the world and everyone would be judged. So the question I have is, did you, in a sense, have to come back to Jewishness? And if you are Jewish, can you describe what your Jewish identity is in the face of that upbringing?
Yeah, but I think I have to backtrack, though, before that. The Jesus phase, we'll call it that, because I was born in Israel, and my mother's from Iraq and my father's from Poland. They're both Jewish. My first 7 years were in Israel, and very much a kind of inculcation of what it was. And when I think about it, I was like born just after around the decade of when Israel was formed. Like Israel was still a young country at that time, and so there was a lot of, like, I remember being at summer camp, and the kind of being in a circle and having to sing these patriotic songs. And I remember standing apart from it, and I don't know why I was removing myself a little bit from it, but I felt something there. And my parents split up when I was young, and my mother remarried, and we came to Canada. And then everything changed, because then my mother uh, would, what she calls herself as a messianic Jew, but basically she believes in Jesus. And my stepfather had this kind of vision around his purposes, and it was all very much connected to this kind of Christian narrative and to salvation and all of that. So I grew up with that, but I still grew up with biblical teachings throughout that time. And um, and and so I think, there are, I wonder, like, how do all of us come to our narratives, or to the kind of values or um, ethical positions that resonate for us. But certainly for me, I think, having had some of that biblical um, exposure, which was to passages that do speak to justice, I somehow, that did resonate with me as a young person. And after I left home and came to Toronto, I went to a Baptist church. My auntie Sophie, who was Jewish and who was born in Bombay, went to this Baptist church, and I was living with her, so I went there, and was then later on part of a more kind of renegade congregation that was part of the Christian Reform tradition. And there they were very kind of like counterculture in their understandings and their ways of, it was reformational faith, and really kind of questioning the precepts in many ways around Christianity. And so that actually was a really formative time. So it's interesting to me that that my coming to feminism, to a kind of justice work, what did come in that congregation, that exposure. But at a certain point, I also really was grappling with that faith, and I couldn't maintain it, and so I left the church, and left a relationship at that point as well. And later on, when I had my kids, at the age when Misha was like at the age, well, I guess he was younger. It was before his but bar mitzvah time. I really wanted my children to know their Jewishness. And I think it was that motivation that in some way brought me back. I think it was also a kind of spiritual need and desire, and a question of belonging as well. Of, where did I belong? Like, I'm not Christian, I'm not Jewish, I'm Arab, I'm Ashkenazi, I'm everything, all of those things. And so I think, and I think also the art community, within the art community, there was just so much work that was beginning around identity stuff at that time. And that helped me also to question all of those things through my artwork. So it was a kind of formation, but it was definitely, for me, a coming back and having to state, yes, I am Jewish, to myself, and to explore that. And then with wanting my children to have some kind of Jewish identification, and looking for a place in which we could do that, Winchevsky was the perfect place. And in fact, that congregation that I was talking about, that Christian congregation in Winchevsky, were kind of like mirrors of each other. One was Christian, one was Jewish, but it was really had some of the same kind of critiques, in terms of the culture at large, and a much more socialist, um, basis. So worldview, as it were, and a challenge to dominant culture, etc. So that's where I felt very at home at Winchevsky.
Yay, Winchevsky!
Yay!
Did,
And so both my sons did their b'nai mitzvahs there, etc.
great. It's so interesting that you were kind of drawn back into Jewishness, and it sounds like kind of like
Yeah.
me. It's through raising children. It's really interesting how there's
Yeah.
almost an atavism that happens where we're drawn back into the fold. They keep like the Godfather. They keep drawing me back in. Um, do you think that there's a sense of Jewishness in your work? Is your this is maybe a silly
Oh,
question. Is your film work Jewish in some way?
you know, that's interesting question, and I've never thought of it in that way. But it is most certainly. But the way I would think about it is it's almost like that deconstructive tradition, the tradition um, of taking things apart. Like I think of Derrida, and I think of people who came from Jewish traditions, but have really influenced the way we philosophically look at things, because it's really about examining things from this angle and this angle and this angle. And and as much as some people might say, certainly about my work on is around Israel Palestine, that it's not objective or whatever, but I think that for me, it really actually comes from that place. And certainly like the pieces around like Fresh Blood, which is around identity. I feel like when I'm approaching the work, I'm wanting to take things apart and analyze them and come at it from this angle and this angle and that angle, that kind of way. And I think that is partly
Like parsing the Torah, like
I
going.
think so. I think so. Yeah.
And we're going to get to the sort of, I think at the core of your work is this idea of hybridization, like as you just touched on it.
Yes.
It's so important to you, and it makes perfect sense considering who you are. Um,
Right.
so I just want to talk. We're going to go into that Palestine-Israel place a little bit. So you make politically engaged films. We've gone over that about all sorts of issues, including feminism, sexuality. The ravages of neoliberalism on human rights and the environment. But one thing that you do return to is Palestine-Israel issues, and not just around Palestinian rights, although that's a big thing. But for example, in Fresh Blood, you're talking about Mizrahi Jews and Arabic Jews in relation to hierarchies and all that stuff. So that's more sort of intra-Israeli film. But
Mhm.
but when did you start really engaging with issues around Palestine, Israel, and why is it so compelling to you as a filmmaker? And is it just because you're Jewish?
I think it's a few things. I mean, certainly, I think having been born in Israel and being Jewish, I feel like there is a specific responsibility around in terms of responding to how Israel has dispossessed Palestinians of their land and their lives sometimes as well. It started really with a slow consciousness, I would say, a slowly growing consciousness. So, I don't think I was that aware when Sabra and Shatila was happening, for example. I started to become more aware around the first Intifada, but not being that active. But I remember when there was that during Oslo and Rabin was flying over Jordan, for the first time. And I remember just crying, so there was some kind of wish and hope, etc. And certainly working on trading on a Fresh Blood, which was really about a return journey and trying to make sense of all of those aspects of Mizrahi and Ashkenazi identities and other aspects of that personal narrative. I had to include Palestine at the time. And when I look at that now, it feels a bit naive because there is somebody there who's also talking about how a two-state solution is the only possible, but that was, yeah, that was the mid 90s. So, but I think that was really the beginning for me of working through a little bit. And and so I think often for Jews who have been brought up in a Zionist kind of context, there is it's a developmental process. My first 7 years I was very close. I spent a lot of time with my grandmother, who was from Iraq, who spoke Arabic. She didn't speak as much as I was growing. She was she was speaking in Hebrew, but I would have heard her and my grandfather speak in Arabic. And so there's something also quite elemental for me. Like I haven't really touched on it in other than, coming back to her in that video, but that there's also something about Arabic culture that when I hear Arabic, I don't understand it, but it feels familiar. It feels like something it's like a comfortable bed or something. I don't know. Like there's just something there. There's some kind of sense of comfort, even though I don't have meaning. But including Hebrew now, I don't have meaning, but it doesn't have the same attachment. So it must be very much connected to my grandparents, I think. But that also meant that, whoa, Palestinians speak Arabic. Palestinians were here first. Why are we treating them as we're doing, like it's very much about a kind of like seeing people around you and noting that there's a second class, third class treatment and citizen, and not for some, not even citizenship there. So I think it was just that kind of thing. Certainly, I was afraid initially to encounter it. I think with trading with Fresh Blood, when I was doing worked it into chapters, so it was very much around a kind of intersectionality, and so it was just one part of that. But when the second Intifada started, that's really when it's kind of like, as they say, the shit hit the fan, because then I was much more aware, more informed, and that's when I started going and documenting more and seeing it for myself. And so I think that's, yeah. Then seeing and being a witness became much more of the motivation.
I want to talk about the sort of hybridization in your work and the hybridization in you, and how it reflects. So one of the there's lots of tensions in a good way in your work. And one of the interesting kind of dialectical relationships is the interplay that you have between what I'll call directness versus artistic intervention, for want of a better term. Like, for example, the Palestine trilogy, obviously has 3 films, and 2 of the films, to my eyes, function kind of like documentaries. One of them slightly more experimental, but still clear. For example, Deir Yassin Remembered, about the Deir Yassin massacre in 1948,
Yeah.
has, on-screen talking head interviews. It has clear histories talked about. It's very, very purposeful and clear and discursive. But the third film, Hot Sand-Filled Wind, is it's literally a poem by Nadia Habib, and it's got filmic intervention. It's like gorgeous, poetic imagery. So my point is, when does it make sense to be poetic about serious subjects, and when does it not?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think Deir Yassin is probably the most direct documentary piece of mine. It's more, yeah, and then even in the desert was really came about just by being in all these locations and feeling like I have to show something, I have to show it, So it was, yeah, exactly, more like documentation as opposed to documentary, I would say. And then when I heard Nadia recite that poem, I was so moved by it, and I thought I have to make this into a video. And what I was also aware of is how dangerous it is to make video out of poetry, because it can be so what's the word? Oh, I'm
Well, not
losing
sure.
my
Either you're going into it can be embarrassing and bad, or it can be.
exactly.
Oh, okay. I thought.
Yeah, it can be really kind of generically sweet and often very direct illustration. Like people often use video in that way, as where the visuals illustrate the words.
Like like
And
a rock video. Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. Yeah.
yeah,
Well, it
and
doesn't do that. Just so you know, Hot Sandfield Wind is
thanks.
fantastic. It's very successful.
Thankfully. And part of it was also the challenge of using documentation and documentary footage, but to use it within this poetic form and to allow for that yearning in a certain way to and something, that emotional aspect of what the occupation involves to come forward. So it had to be more affective, and yet at the same time I wanted it to be grounded in images of what was actually going on. So it's a kind of activist poem, I guess,
No,
in
I
a
think
certain.
it's absolutely wonderful. But my question, and maybe my next question will express it better. So I want to talk about trading the future because I think it's just magnificent. I was so moved by all the work, but for some reason that one really hit home with me in a way. More recent than these others. And it's a film where you really balance, and this is what I was getting at, you really balance documentary and poetic sensibility in a wonderful way. There's stunning nature photography, but there's also, and sort of poetic interventions, but there's also really clear discussions about capitalism as being kind of an agent of the apocalypse, or and that previously religious ideas about the end times have now been taken up by market economies. But the line that really stuck out for me was, quote, "Capitalism has a hatred of the complex," unquote. And I think this not only sums up the film Trading the Future, but it kind of sums up you and your work. Because your work, to my mind, and this is what I was getting at before, seems to be about hybridity and complexity, and that these things are beautiful and necessary, and that there's no such thing as purity. Am I getting to it's something like? Can you talk about this?
I appreciate that. It's hard to articulate, but I think it is that aspect where the personal is not only personal to oneself. The personal is part of a collective, and I am at the nexus of historical forces that I have had no control over, and I've been determined by a lot of these forces, not just in terms of my own sense of myself as a woman or somebody in Western culture, but it's it's about seeing how it affects my way of seeing the world, my emotional life, my relationships. So there's all of that. I want all of that to be in there. And it takes me a while to make the work often. I'm not that prolific, I would say. And it's partly because I'm trying to navigate between those layers and wanting to first of all have an understanding and make a connection between in terms of like how I have become situated in the world, but how all of us are in fact affected by these forces, whether it's capital or colonization um, or expectations around how we behave or any number of different things, certainly religious and other forces, and they all converge, and it feels like it's a weaving and an unweaving, that's been that's kind of the approach, trying to figure out the wet.
I
Yeah.
love that a weaving and an unweaving. That's great, and I mean,
Mm.
your films really do feel like that. Again, that they're either in the same moment. Your films feel like dead simple, focused and
Mm.
dead simple on an issue or on an injustice, but also wonderfully and necessarily complicated at the same time. I think that's what I'm getting at, and I think that maybe that's what that weaving and unweaving gets at as well. It's great.
Thanks very much for that. It's nice to have sometimes reflection back on it because, yeah, when you're in the middle of it, it's like, yeah.
Maybe we could just end with a more general talk about progressive Jewishness and what it means. So, like, what kind of topics, causes, or actions do you think secular and progressive Jewish communities should be focusing on right now?
I think Jewish organizations would be well placed to put themselves in relationship to other organizations that are fighting fascism, for example, but not only focusing on anti-Semitism, but seeing ourselves as part of a coalition of a large force that is for really acknowledging everybody who lives here. So that would be certainly foremost indigenous looking at it, indigenous dispossession, and then we can make those links to Israel Palestine and what Israel is doing there, but to Black Lives Matter, to so many of the different kinds of ways in which people are being excluded, denied. The refugees right now are, and the level of just incarceration that there's, like there's just so many aspects of people don't have to take all of it on at once, that we could take one thing, everybody takes just one thing, and have, these groups that are connected that can work on these different issues. I think those are the kinds of ways to make change, but to actually be very grounded in saying that when we're talking about freedom, we're talking about it for all people and not just for ourselves. And when we're talking about affluence and comfortable living and et cetera, that it's not just for Jews, it's for everybody with whom we are in relation. And I mean, that has to be part of our secular vision, I would say, a human justice vision, but and not get into the weeds, I guess, that's the way to, yeah.
I do want to ask you one more question. Tell me a film that I should watch, a film that is either experimental or a documentary that I might not know about. Tell me, recommend a film to me, and tell me why.
What's interesting is I just showed my students a film that I love. And often, people say, what's your favorite film? And it's really hard to say what's a favorite film. But there's one, and I wish it would be more available. It's called The Body Beautiful. And I just showed it to them because for some reason it was made in like 1991. And it's by a filmmaker named Ngozi Unwaru, whose father was Nigerian and whose mother was British, white British, and Anglo-British, I guess. It really beautifully weaves her narrative with her mother's narrative. And her mother is middle-aged. She's had a mastectomy. She's got arthritis. And she puts her mother in the video. And so it's a real talk about hybrid. It's a beautiful film where the personal is interwoven in there. It's very much around Black identity in Britain, but it's just a really compelling piece. Of course, there's just so many films. It's just so hard to think through. I mean, anything from, Tantura, which is made by Zionist filmmaker, but it's about undoing this kind of narrative around the Nakba and of Israel's culpability. Yeah, there's so many.
What you just said too, and they're amazing. So thank you so much for this, Yael. It was really great talking to you, and really the treat for me was getting to watch the films again, because it's an amazing body of work, and I didn't get to see all of them, but I saw enough to get a sense of your identity as an artist and filmmaker, and keep up the good work.
Thanks so much. Thanks for asking me, David.
Well, we've come to the end of our show. We'd like to thank you for listening, and we'd like to thank everyone who made our podcast possible, including United Jewish People's Order Executive Director Serena Sarin and our guest, P.H. Yael. This podcast was recorded at Walt Whitman Studios in Toronto. The theme music was composed by Serena Sarin with help from me. My name is David Wall. Until next time, seid gesund.